Welcoming our inclusion committee member and member of the Modern Witches community since the beginning, Jessie Susannah, also known as Money Witch. Very excited to be having this conversation with you today. And I know our audience, our viewers are going to be super inspired. So welcome.
Hi.
I would love it if you could just give a little bit of an introduction to yourself, your work, so that folks know who you are, know what you do.
I have a business called Money Witch and a practice called Money Witch. And in that practice, I do tax work, tax preparation, tax education, tax planning for hustlers, healers, and creatives. I do intuitive financial coaching, which is sort of practical, emotional, and spiritual guidance around people's financial questions and around people's lives, just using a financial lens that incorporates astrology and intuition. And then I do money magic and work as a sort of priestess of money, priestess of the egregore of money. And I make medicine, I make gem essences, and gem that you take orally, that you use as a spray, as an oil. And I write and educate and have some online workshops around, all premised around healing your finances.
So much.
So
Beautiful.
much.
I'm curious to know, when you kind of realized or affirmed your connection to spirit and what that looked like for you.
I mean, it's like when you ask that question, there's like different moments that come to mind. And, but I think that from a pretty young child, I have always felt spiritual, like trusting in God. And in tune with other dimensions, but maybe not in a super clear, like I wasn't a kid who super clearly was like, I talk to fairies or I talk to dead people or, really clearly as a kid. But I think just like very trusting. I feel like my connection to spirit has always been a little more like mystical than I don't know, than witchy or something like that. They're just like a slightly different flavor. And I feel like my revelations have kind of like been in that realm. And then but I feel like really taking it on and like affirming my relationship to spirituality. And I grew up being raised religious, Unitarian Universalist, which is like, the wackiest religion. So or like one that really invites a lot of like kind of mystical or like philosophical knowledge, like, kind of from across the spectrum. Um, but I think in like late high school, like into my first year of college was really when I felt like the most large scale kind of personal encounters with spirit and like mystical revelations that kind of like really affirmed to me like a sort of never ending, I don't know, contract or just relationship with spirit. Yeah, like big, with big like creator spirit.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. It's so interesting to know, how we each kind of find ourselves on this witch path. And yeah, I'm interested in how, you define witch as something that's, part of your business and also a personal identification.
Identification did not come to me until much later on. I was not, I always joke, like my boyfriend is goth and I'm like, oh, I like don't have a goth bone in my body. You know, like I was not like watching The Craft or, you know, I wasn't really doing that stuff. But I was like, you know, painting angels and I don't know. I've always felt a little more like kind of mystical religious, maybe. But the witch, I feel like the witch word didn't really come for me personally until would have been like 2012, like late 2011. And I just sort of, to me, it's connected to like the way that I build energetic and spiritual relationship into like everything that I'm doing. And the way that those things like live in kind of like the home for me. I feel like witchcraft is very sort of like personal and home based. I mean, I don't think it has to be exclusively those things, but I think there's you know, a strong streak and element of that. So to me, it's about the way that kind of like magical and spiritual practices live within the small actions and like the spaces that I'm inhabiting. And also about being in control of my energy and like using my energy intentionally and like asking for collaboration of like the energy of other sources like gems or animals or, you know, birds or like other people or archetypes or deities, that that like intentionality with my energy in creation, like seeing myself as capable of creation from an energetic place, that is what sort of like shifted my taking on of that relationship, the relationship to the word witch.
What do you think about the term modern witch? Does that resonate with you, and what do you think it means?
Yeah, I think because I don't have a strong emotional connection to anything, any concept of witchcraft outside of modern witchcraft, it is not as essential for me to differentiate. And it's not like I had no relationship to it. You know, like I did like Reiki training when I was 14 at like a metaphysical bookstore. You know, like it's not like I don't have any kind of anything connection, but I don't have connection. I never had connection to like pagan community or like definition of the self outside of like my own self-defining. I didn't do that defining within like defined community. I did it within the context of like people who were close to me who were also on these pretty like self-chosen journeys, you know, and no one who was sort of like defining through like a pagan or Wiccan, you know, witch lineage, and a lot of people who were like Jewish witches, but not necessarily coming from, you know, like a 70s or 20s or, you know, whatever kind of European based witchcraft identity. So I think the differentiation doesn't feel like something I needed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of like this. I mean, it's like any witch is gonna, like any witch is a modern witch, like at the time in which she is living, or he is living, or they are living, you know. So it's sort of like, it's like witch, like right now, witch. But I think a lot in terms of like my business, definitely like coming up in a wave, right? Like there's a wave of witchcraft, like, you know, which we can think about in different ways. Like we could say like, oh, witchcraft is trending, you know, or like any, you know, witchcraft is being co-opted by capitalism, like again, you know, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Which I think has like happened multiple times, you know, it just like looks different, right? But like there's all these waves of it, you know, like where it's like, oh, spiritual, you know, like people were having like seances and like major, you know, there's just different waves. And but so I feel like, you know, there is like a wave in the collective consciousness around witchcraft for sure. And I think it's like helpful to name, you know, to name things. Like I love to name things. I have an Aquarius moon. I think you also have an Aquarius moon.
Yep.
Yeah. And so to me, it's like I spend all my time in therapy, always like, even though I'm supposed to be doing somatic things, I'm just like, I have to get the words. Like I have to get the words for everything or else I feel uncomfortable, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yep.
I think like a naming, like I love naming and language. And I feel like that's a big part of the work that I do in helping people with the finances is really like giving people language for some of the like experiences that they're having. Or the unhealed experience, the unhealed and healing experiences that they're having within the context of like their financial life. So to me, I've thought, you know, I've thought about it like, yeah, sort of what is this wave of witchcraft called? And I think a lot about the aesthetic of it because I'm also like a deeply aesthetic person. Aesthetic is very important to me. The aesthetic of my business is important to me. And I feel like in my business, I use aesthetic as an accessibility point to like facilitate access to financial information, but also facilitate access to healing. And I do think that, you know, where it can get, I think it can get trivialized, right? Like aesthetic, you know, some people feel like aesthetic is trivial, but I think aesthetic is like an important accessibility issue because it's like aesthetic is sort of signaling who something is for. And I think that for me, like maybe even, I mean, I never really thought about it, but I maybe part of like why I wasn't as interested in witchcraft like earlier on is because it didn't feel like aesthetically interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so aesthetic, you know, so it's like I'm not really attracted to like the gothic aesthetic, you know, the goth aesthetic or like, you know, that kind of like Halloween vibes, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not attracted to kind of like, you know, medieval like Europe energy really, aesthetically. And so maybe it just didn't feel appealing ever, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that like finding my own place with it and then engaging with the aesthetic of it to like create access for other people. And there's so like I feel like that is really one of the like defining features of like if you know, and I don't totally know, right? The question is like, what do I think of the concept of modern witches, right? So it's like, you know, I'm sure you have your own way more in-depth relationship to it. But if I think about it, I think of it as like a naming of this like wave of witchcraft. And I think one of the absolute defining features of this like wave of witchcraft, you know, from a kind of like sociological perspective or whatever, or anthropological perspective, I don't really know the definition of like those words or like which one is the right one, but would be the like engaging of like relevant aesthetic as a tool of accessibility.
Totally.
That piece is big to me, both in the way I work and in the way that I think I think that's like, yeah, that's really something that like people are focusing on, like practitioners are like focusing on that. Not everybody, of course, but like a lot. I think it's really key. So I think about that.
Yeah. That's I think that's so real. And I mean, as you were talking, I was remembering when I was starting my business and sort of like feeling like as a tarot reader, I had to show up in a certain way that was like bohemian and just like very like rooted in something that was not mine. And I had to really face that and look at it and say, why do I feel like I have to dress a certain way or show up a certain way in order to practice something that is personal and like my own relationship, my own connection with spirit. And I do think in this new wave of modern witchcraft, there's so many people doing it their own way. And it's so beautiful to be able to see that maybe as someone who is on their own spiritual path and looking around and seeing that they can do it their own way too, you know?
Yeah, it makes me think of this idea of like who is a vessel, you know, because when you were saying that about the tarot reading, it made me think of like, yeah, what if you like showed up to your, you know, I'm thinking of like early tarot reading events, right? Like people who are professional tarot readings and like the kind of gigs that maybe they're starting out at, where it's like maybe you're like reading at a bar, or you're like, you know, sitting at a whatever. So it's like, what if you showed up in like, like a suit or like, you know, khakis and like a button down, or like, you know, I don't know, like I don't even know what else it would be, right? Or like sweatpants, you know, and kind of being like, oh, that somehow, you know, the indicator, like the aesthetic indicator is like you don't have as much access to spirit, right? Like if you had access to spirit, like you would look a certain way.
Yeah, like wear velvet or something. I don't know.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. Yeah, you would look a certain way and you would be kind of like signaling, right? Like what it, you know, signaling access to spirit. But it reminds me of there's a few you know, spiritual concepts. I feel like it's like when spiritual information like comes into the world through someone where you're kind of like, oh my God, this person, but like the access to information is so great, you know. And there's like a really important Jewish practice that was kind of like rediscovered and brought into like a modern context through this guy. And I remember going to see him speak one time with a friend of mine, and it's a super important like mindfulness practice. It's like very old. It was really like pretty much destroyed. Like all the practitioners mostly were like killed in the Nazi Holocaust. And but it's like a very ancient, like mystical mindfulness practice. But we went to go see the guy talk, and I was with a friend, and it's just like we're both former sex workers, and I was just kind of saying like, it's like, oh, like it's just so funny that God like chose this guy to like be the vessel, you know what I mean? And we're just like, yeah, like sometimes it's just like some trick is just like the vessel, you know, for like God just like chooses some trick to like be the vessel of like very, very, very like deep and important spiritual knowledge. And yeah, I just think it's like, it doesn't, I think there's a piece of humility in that as well, right? Because it's like no person is like more or less worth like being a vessel, and essentially we're all vessels, you know, and sometimes we can kind of like feel like, oh, well, because I'm like bringing this knowledge, like I'm superior, or you know what I mean, like there's something about me that's like so great, and I'm like, no, God chooses like all kinds of people to bring knowledge through like all the time. It's really not an indication of like, you know, anything. Like we're all worthy and all like not worthy. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think like that question of like who is a vessel, you know, and like what, how would they be like signifying, you know, like the signifiers of the vessel. And I'm curious, like I'm sure that there's ways that we're doing it now, even that like are problematic and, you know, creating like their own set of gatekeeping, you know, whatever it is. So I'm curious about it.
Mm.
Um, but I really do like to just like show up. I don't worry about it. I don't really worry about looking like a witch, or I don't know.
Yeah.
Sometimes, you know, so much of it is like other people's perception, and like you were saying, right? Like it's not, has nothing to do with you. It's like you look different ways. Like I look all different ways, different days, you know? Like
Totally.
I'm like, sometimes I just look like carpool, sweatpants mom, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, how you're seen and perceived is like, you only have so much control over it. But it
Totally.
is so
Yeah.
personal. It is so personal and so deep. And so it is interesting and weird to be like, oh, I need to be like putting on the signifiers of this in
Yeah.
order to be successful.
Absolutely. It's like, you know, your witchcraft is your own. So it's only going to work for you if it works for you.
Yeah. And then, you know, I mean, I feel like because of there's this wave, right? Like a lot of, and because it's so aesthetic, there are a lot of people who are engaging from like a more aesthetic, like maybe less depth, practice based place. And then I think there's a lot of other people who have a lot of feelings about that happening, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And there's like a lot of places where that can kind of like get exploited, right? Or that like leaves open a lot of space for like cultural exploitation. Um, so there's like a little bit different angle of it, right? Like it's like you don't have to look like a witch to have a witch practice, and you also like, just because you look like a witch doesn't mean you have a witch practice, you know? Like all of those things
Exactly.
are, so yeah.
All of those things are true for sure. You talked a little bit about this, but I'm curious about your personal lineage and your personal history and how that has shaped your witchcraft and the work you do.
The biggest thing, well, I guess to start more at the beginning, you know, I was raised Unitarian Universalist, and one of the premises of that religion, for anyone who doesn't, it's essentially like a Christian lineage. It's like Christianity without Jesus or God. It's like how I would describe it. Like it's definitely like Christian lineage religion, but the kind of premise, I think it does a little bit have some origins in that kind of like spiritualist, like European spiritualist energies, where it's like, let's get together and like hold space to experience like community in a spiritual sense, and let's you know, read texts from different communities, or you know, poems, and the idea is essentially like all paths lead to spirit, you know. um but also that you don't have to believe in like God TM, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like that I grew up with like a very like religion was really important to my family, but it also wasn't something that felt like limiting to me, or that I had that felt like hard in any kind of way. So I feel like I actually learned and like trained in a lot of like ritual and kind of like ritual leadership through being raised Unitarian, because it's like I did like youth group and conferences, and you know, did like held space within kind of like youth leadership context. And I feel like we did a lot of kind of like ritual creation and those sorts of things, and sort of like bringing in like nature elements. So I feel like that is like an important piece that informed, like that's, I think of like, what is the tools in my toolbox, you know, my kind of like witchcraft toolbox. So I feel like that is like the basis for, like being raised Unitarian is sort of like the basis for being able to craft ritual and feeling comfortable in like a spiritual leadership perspective and like position for sure. Then I started having like, you know, sort of mystical revelations. I explored like a lot of different religions, like major religions, and kind of like almost, you know, did whatever. Like I almost got baptized as Christian. I like considered Islam for a while. I like, you know, read a bunch of Buddhism and kind of like went in that path for a little minute. And then in, I think it was like 2005, I started a practice to convert to Judaism. So my ancestral lineage, or like DNA lineage, is Western European, mostly German, like Germanic and Celtic. And and my family is not, so my family is not Jewish. But in 2005, I started a conversion process. And so I became Jewish. And then all of my kind of like witchcraft origins were all coming within the context of like my kind of Jewish coven, like this coven, little Jewish coven. So coming within like keeping time and sort of doing witchcraft like overlaid with Judaism. So that is, they're very like bound to me, like my religious self and my religious self and my kind of like witchcraft self are very intertwined to me. And then it's really only been like a couple of years. I want to say maybe 3. That felt true. 3 years. It might have only been like 2 years. I think it's been like about 2 or 3 years ago. I like got called into a devotional relationship with Hermes Mercury. So I work with him, and then that kind of opened up more of a perspective for me. Like I felt like I needed to then kind of learn about like how do people work in devotional relationship with a spirit, because it wasn't like I wasn't like looking for it. It just sort of like happened to me. So I felt like I had to get a lot of like context for that, and then I sort of I feel like I've kind of repositioned my relationship to my spiritual practice, like both religiously and witchcraft a little bit, like through the lens of like serving spirit, like different spirits, serving spirits. Answer the question. Is that the question you wanted the answer?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for sharing. I think it's so, I get the question a lot around, you know, if you're Christian, can you be a witch? Or if you're, you know, Buddhist, can you be a witch? And I think the way you answered that kind of beautifully illustrates how you can blend traditions. And
yeah, I mean, I think the answer to those questions, I think very few witches would say you can't do both, you know, but maybe more like religious figures would say you can't do both, right? So it's like usually the kind of the no is coming from the religious aspects, but I think it's up to you to really decide like what you think is true from a religious perspective. I mean, because for example, like, I mean, it's anti-Jewish, absolutely, to be in devotional relationship with Hermes Mercury. 100%, you know, because just like Christianity or Islam, like it's these are the monotheistic religions, right? So it's like, how do we how do you hold like monotheism and like polytheism together at the same time? And honestly, a lot of it has to do with people's personalities. Like, I just don't have a problem with it. I'm just like, sure, you know, which I do attribute somewhat to like the Unitarian background, right? Because I'm sort of like, you know, I'm like, it's all the same. Like, I feel like literally, I'm a religious person. I could be any religion, honestly, and be happy and doing the same. I feel like I'd be positioned in the same place, you know, because, and I think that's the mystical lens, right? Like, the mystical lens is like, this is the path that I'm on because I have to be on a path, but all paths essentially spring from and lead to the same place.
Source.
So I think it's like, as if you feel comfortable with that, but some people don't feel comfortable with that, right? And then they kind of like do that. Or that I started, like, I also am very, very into like history, right? And reading about and kind of researching and trying to understand the historical context that frames our relationship to spirit, you know, and our relationship to each other. And I feel like, you know, so for example, within Judaism, it's like there's one God, for sure, one God. And you have to be in explicit like solo service. Like, that's the deal, right? Because if you think about like, when were these religions being created, you know, when did Judaism come about? It's coming about in a polytheistic geographic context. And so really the way that people would have thought about it would have been like, no, I'm getting an exclusive service to this one God. That's what we're doing. And so even though I think the idea of like service to a God, like, it feels like it can feel very foreign to someone who is like religious in a kind of like Abrahamic tradition, right? To think about this idea of like serving gods, but essentially that's what they're doing, right? They're just like, oh, that's where that springs from, this exclusive spiritual servitude to one God. But like within Judaism, you know, God has, I don't even know, like hundreds of names. And all of the different names like indicate a kind of different like facet or attribute of God. And so to me, I think about it like like how garnets are shaped in that kind of like multifaceted way, or like my kid's a little like gamer nerd and plays like the Magic the Gathering. So there's like 20-sided dice or whatever, you know. So it's like, I think of kind of like monotheism with Judaism. Like, when I was reconciling those two things, I think about God, like it's like monotheism, but in that way, right? Like, it's like one God, but the God has like all these different aspects. And in a certain way, I was like, okay, well, you know, and people that I know within Judaism, like, who are kind of in a more like spiritual lens on Judaism, usually kind of have relationship to like, you know, one or two, like there might be different facets that feel really strong. And I'm sort of like, okay, well, what is different about sort of like being in relationship to like certain facets, right? Being in a strong and kind of devotional relationship to a couple different facets of God. Like, what's really different from that to like being in relationship with like multiple deities? Or like, you know, if you're going to get even more mystical, like, are the multiple deities like even actual like, you know, distinct entities, or could they be like facets of one thing? Like, is there only one energy? So I don't know. I think there's a lot of like, I think it can all, I think there is a place of reconciliation in that, in the way that kind of like, I think monotheism is sort of a little forced. Yeah, I mean, even within Christianity, right? Like very like, oh, the Trinity, right? So it's
Right.
like, okay, so it's like one God, but it's three gods with like very distinct personalities.
And then there's
Okay.
Mary too, who, you know, is
Absolutely.
such a big figure.
Yeah. So, it's like, and then the saints and, it's like actually, it's
Yeah.
really polytheistic, like
Yeah.
Christianity is like very polytheistic, especially Catholicism,
Yeah.
right? I mean, but even like Protestantism with the Trinity and Mary, right? Like that's enough. That's four, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess I'm just like, um is monotheism really monotheistic anyway? So then who cares?
Totally. And from a historical perspective, you know, when those monotheistic religions were taking shape, they also had to convince the polytheistic believers to kind of join. So it's a bit of a holdover, it seems like. It's like, okay, you can still have Mary or the goddess if you,
Absolutely.
yeah, participate with us. So,
Yeah, and much, there is, some like probably there is some uncoerced conversion, and then there's like so much coerced conversion, right?
mm-hmm.
In terms of monotheism. So then there's like, if you think of like all of the generations of people who like haven't necessarily really believed the thing, there's all these like multifaceted relationships to it. I just am gonna go out there and be like, I think like, yeah, all religions are polytheistic.
I buy that.
Yeah, I
I'm
think
on
it's
that
true.
page. Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know. I'm not an extensive like religious scholar about like every religion. So, obviously there's an element of bullshit to what I'm saying, but I feel like that's true. I feel like that's true.
Yeah, and I think about you know, modern psychotherapy or Jungian archetypes. It's like a very similar idea of like acknowledging yourself in the archetypal diversity and knowing that you can find yourself in all those things, and it comes
Yeah,
back
and
to
you
that
have, I
mystical.
mean, very basic, like, oh, your inner children, there's you and your inner children. Like
Yeah.
yesterday I was like at therapy and I had like been talking about something that I had been triggered about. And, it's like, okay, we're already like, well, here's two different inner children. And then there's like me as like my resource adult. And then there's like the other resource adult archetype that I call on to like support that one so I'm like, okay, well, it's like one body, like four people, like already, you know what I mean? If we're only just thinking about that, right? But yeah, there's something about I'm like, is there any difference between being like, there's one guy with like 20 different personalities versus like there's 20 different guys? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if it's like really ultimately that different.
Totally.
But
Yeah, and
I
there's
like the pulling apart. Like I like the pulling apart into the different strands to really like see it and be in relationship to all the different parts. Like I think that that's very helpful. That it really helps me navigate, like psychologically. It's part of what I do in my work, religiously, spiritually. And so that's what I go with.
Is there a token of wisdom or some advice that you would give to someone who's feeling like kind of like maybe lost or overwhelmed with either the diversity of paths or not knowing where to go next or where to look?
I think I feel like this is indirect advice. I'm like, I would offer like a story from my own experience or just like something that has been helpful to me in my own experience, which is that even though I am a huge thinker and in general, I think very much about everything, I've given myself the gift. I feel like this has been a huge gift that I've given myself, is that I do not overthink my spiritual practices. If something comes and it feels right, I just go with it. And I don't worry about if it's true or not. And I think that's a place where like a lot of people get caught up, is like, you know, resonating with something or like wanting something to be a part of their life, but then doubting it, you know, or like wondering whether it is actually the right path. And I feel like for me, you know, the spiritual path, which to me, everyone is on a spiritual path, because it's just literally like the path that your spirit is walking. You know, like your spirit is walking a path in this world. And there will be pieces of information that are given to you in so many different ways. You know, like if we're staying on the path metaphor, like it's like you might see it on a billboard, you might like notice a number on a mile marker, you know, you might be like the song that was playing on the radio, it might be like something that somebody, you know, sitting in the car with you said. It might be like when you went to the gas station and you like noticed whatever on the counter, you know. So it's like, I feel like for me, I just really accept, like, I'm on a path, pieces of information will come to me, like a book will land in my life, or, you know, I'll get a reading and someone will like say something to me, or I'll just have an experience of resonance, like something will come and I'll have an experience of resonance. And then I'll just kind of like chase that thread for a while. Like, okay, what is this? But I think it's that piece, that little like existential crisis moment where people talk themselves out of following the thread, you know, with all this kind of like, well, what is it? What is this thread? Is it the right thread? Am I allowed to have this thread? Like, am I sure this is the thread for me? Like, why this thread rather than another thread? Like, maybe I should explore and find more threads, you know? And I'm just like, I think that is like, that's where people, I feel like intuition is very simple. It's the overthinking and the kind of existential crisis part that where people talk themselves out of what they already know.
Right.
So I think that just feeling confident that all you have to do is explore like the next thing that has come, you know, in front of you, and that will like take you to the next, that will take you to the next place that you need to go. Yeah, so I really would just say, like, don't overthink it, which I think it's like, it feels hard to someone that's like trying to figure something out, you know, but I feel like it's like, I'm like, stop trying to figure it out so hard.
Yep.
And just like less thinking, more doing. Just do something. You know what I mean? Like get whatever. Read a book. You know, go to the practice. I also think too, in the world of, you know, and as Aquarius moon, it's like, yes, I want to learn about everything all the time, you know. But I think like in this world where it's like, okay, learning, there's so much options to like learn about spiritual practice. And the other thing so I guess the other piece of wisdom I would say is like learning about spiritual practice is different from doing spiritual practice. So I would say, like, you know, and there's a time for both, right? Because you do want to have the knowledge, and we do, especially in the ways that it is about like being respectful of lineage. But I would say just like doing something, you know what I mean? Like I would like, it's like pull a tarot card every morning and like look it up in the book and just, or just like pull a tarot card every morning and just stare at it and write down what you saw. And I feel like that you almost will like get more out of that than like taking a class about like how to read tarot.
100%. There's a term
like
less thinking. There's definitely this funny term that I came across at the right time in my life, and it's the armchair occultist, which is someone who just like reads all the books about the occult theory and like doesn't do the work or do the practices. And I definitely was guilty of that like 10 years ago. And then I was like, oh wait, I can, like, you're so attracted to the ideas and the thoughts. And then when you realize that you can have an embodied experience, it's like a whole nother world opens up.
Yeah, I think because like my first experiences with like occult or like mystical stuff were, they were so visceral, like they were just so like physical experiences, right? That that's the experience. Like I always want it, you know, like I want to engage in it. But yeah, I think just trusting yourself, you know, which is different from like entitlement and overconfidence, right? You know what I mean? Like, which I'm just going to throw that out because especially a lot of the work that we have been doing, you know, on the inclusion committee, right? Where you're like, just because you're doing something doesn't mean you can like teach it, or, you know, it's like you have to be a student before you can be a practitioner, before you can be a teacher. But I think you can be like a doer before you're a student. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. And final question would be, what is magic to you?
Magic to me is taking responsibility for your own energy and using it intentionally and recognizing that everything and everyone around you, you know, also has an energetic force, and being intentional and mindful about the way that you sort of engage and combine energies in order to like influence creation.
Beautiful. So where can folks find you and continue to learn from you? Any offerings coming up?
Yeah, people can find me at moneywitch.com. You can find me on Instagram at money.witch. You can find me on YouTube here at moneywitch, and or youtube.com/moneywitch. And I have several online courses. I have the like energetic money magic medicine that I make. I have a zine, and then in January 2022, I have my book coming out, which is probably like my most exciting big new offering that's coming out in the world.
Amazing. Does it have a title you can share, or?
Yes, it's called, I always mess up the subtitle. It's called Money Magic. So it's called, this is what I think it's Money Magic, Practical Wisdom and Empowering Rituals to Heal Your Finances.
Ooh.
By the Money Witch. But it's Money Magic by the Money Witch, and it'll be out on Chronicle Books, January 2022.
How exciting. Great. Oh, well, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, this was really fun. I appreciate talking to you always.
Yeah, always. I love the Aquarian moon.
I know. It's
I feel like I could just go in very many different directions, but
yeah, I have an Aquarius moon, and my Mercury is in Pisces, so I feel like that. Like there's something about those two things together where I'm just like, wah, like more when I talk, you know, like the talking part, I can really like, yeah, get in the kind of armchair occultist vibe for sure.
Yeah.
Like philosophize about it for a
Love it.
while. Yeah.
Love it. Love it. Well, thank you so much. I'm excited for all that's to come with Modern Witches and Money Witch. So,
Thank you for having me.
of course.